It's interesting if you go. I have an outline of stuff for services, and I think there's been one for Sunday night now for 3 weeks back there. So we're finally going to get into what I wanted to start 3 weeks ago. So we will. We're going to pick this up in Mark chapter 14, verse 27. Okay, some interesting things I hope that you will find and you will see here tonight as we have the opportunity to see what Mark says and how of Jesus going through trials of Peter denying Jesus, Jesus getting ready to go to the cross. So again, we're going to pick it up in chapter 14, starting in verse 27, and we will actually going to we're going to go down to quite a ways. So just be patient with me. We're going to go down to verse 52. Okay, listen to what it says. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, because it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." But Peter said to him, "Even though all may fall away, yet I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, that this very night, before a rooster crows twice, you yourself will deny me 3 times. But Peter kept saying insistently, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And they all were saying the same thing also. They came to the place named Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here until I have prayed." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be very distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch." And he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass by him by. And he was saying, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the 3rd time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us go. Let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were with him, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard." After coming, Judas immediately went to him, saying, "Rabbi," and kissed him. They laid hands on him and seized him, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple, teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures." And they all left him and fled. A young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he pulled free from the linen sheet and escaped naked. I want us to take a few moments, and I want us to focus on a passage at the very, very beginning of that. Would you not agree that Peter was many, many times very outspoken, right? And as you notice that we read here that the other disciples were very much just as outspoken in this case about that they would not forsake Jesus either. Okay, but I want to do something here. If you would go back to verse 27, okay? Verse 27, we see here Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is in the Mount of Olives. And Gethsemane means oil press. And there's a whole bunch of olives that are there. And Jesus began to warn his disciples of something. Okay? And in fact, it says he warned them very clearly. He said in verse 27, he says, "You will all fall away." Okay? This wasn't a statement that he made that they were going to have the option to fall away. He told them, this is what you will do. Okay, did you catch that? This is what he said. This is what's going to happen. You will fall away. And so he began and went on to there, and he's reminding them of this. It's interesting because it's something we probably never really thought a whole bunch about. But if you look at this, at the end of verse 27, it says this. I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. That's from Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. Okay, and I want us to see something here. He was saying to them, this is what's going to happen. They're going to take me, and you're going to flee. Okay, this is what's going to happen. That was the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. It's interesting here. Did they flee? Some. So some did. Some did not. Okay, so we'll get into that in just a moment. But you saw that prophecy that was going to take place there. I mean, the disciples were so caught up in the moment that they had a hard time grasping what it was exactly Jesus was saying. And one of the things here if you remember, when Jesus Christ was revived, if you will, brought back to life 3 days after his death. If you remember, what did the disciples say? Are you sure? Are you certain? Because we saw him die, right? And so here we see these words being spoken. He's warning them of their unbelief. He's warning them of these things. He's warning them that, you know what, the resurrection is going to happen. And the reports came back that, hey, this is what's going to happen. I will come back to life. And you remember, the angel gave him a special reminder. If you go to Mark chapter 16, if you go just to verses 6 and 7, okay? I want you to see something here about what was happening. Again, Mark chapter 16, verses 6 and 7. And this is the angel speaking. And the angel says this, and he said to them, do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. They heard those words over and over again. Right? Over and over again, they heard the words that Jesus was not coming to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. Over and over again, they thought Jesus was going to get rid of these Romans, that Jesus was going to make a kingdom right. Over and over, they thought these things. And over again, Jesus was like, no, that's not why I came. That's not what's going to happen. And so here we see in these very beginning of these verses here in Mark chapter 14, that all of a sudden, here we have these words. If they simply would have listened. Now, I have to admit there's times I don't listen very good. Would you guys admit that about yourself? There's times maybe we don't listen very good. The disciples didn't listen very good. Okay? Peter didn't listen at all. Okay? Because Jesus said, and you will what? What did it say there? It says, and you will fall away. Peter's like, I'm not going to fall away. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, you will fall away. Okay? And Peter's like, And the other disciples said what? But what did he read to them? He said, you will. Okay. So now we know from having the scriptures, we know that once Jesus Christ was arrested, that some of the disciples, in fact, the disciples scattered. Some of them, again, they're like, hey, you know what? We'll stay right here and we're going to do this. And what did Jesus say? You're going to deny me, Peter. You're going to deny me. But remember, the fact of the matter is, the prophecy said, when you smite the shepherd, the sheep will be scattered. And Peter was a sheep, and he refused to be scattered. What if Peter would have listened? It wouldn't have changed anything. Did you know that? Wouldn't have changed. Jesus still would have went to the cross. Jesus still would have rose again on the third day. And Peter wouldn't have chopped the ear off of the guy in the garden. Okay? I mean, he would have if he would have just listened to Jesus when they came and they scattered. He was so upset. He did all these things, and then Jesus even said, "This is what you are going to do. You will be scattered." The prophet said so. Okay. Again, everybody but Peter. Peter didn't scatter. He stayed there. He didn't scatter. He was running off. What did Peter do? Peter went into the garden, didn't he? He went in and he warmed himself by the fire. He said, "I don't know this guy. I don't know this guy. I don't know this guy." But what if Peter would have listened? None of that would have happened. None of it would have happened. It would have changed the fact Jesus got arrested. He still would have been arrested, still would have been put on trial, still would have been put on a cross. But Peter just for whatever reason refused to do that. It's very, very interesting. And John, let's go for a moment to John chapter 18. Okay? John chapter 18, verse 8. And let's see here what John has to say about some of these things. Here it is. John chapter 18, verse 8, it says this. And in verse 7 it says, therefore he again asked them, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. Okay? Verse 8. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. I am the one you're looking for. So if you seek me, let these guys go their way. He said, let them go. He was saying to let them go. And Peter was like, I'm not going. Peter ended up in the courtyard. He ended up being accused 3 times. He ended up denying his Christ, denying Jesus. He did all of these things. And remember that it's interesting here that we can't miss the point here. Is that when Jesus tells us to do something, we need to do it. He told the disciples to flee. The prophecy from Zechariah said they would flee. Okay? And they didn't. And Peter did not. They all did not. And so we see this happening here. And many times people are they're like, we can't really be that hard on Peter. He at least was right there with Jesus. Now, I've done this. I've looked at this. But the fact of the matter is he wasn't supposed to be there. Jesus said, you're not supposed to be here, but he was still there. Did you guys catch that? Zechariah said, the sheep will be scattered. All right? And right there in chapter 18, right here in John, chapter 18, verse 8, Jesus said, let all of them go. Okay? And they didn't. They didn't go anywhere. He stayed right there over and over again. And what if Peter would have followed the instructions properly? What if Peter would have left? Would he have denied Jesus 3 times? Okay? I mean, think about this. He wasn't even supposed to be there. Okay, Jesus told him, let them go. All right? He wasn't even supposed to be there, but yet that's exactly where he ended up. Ended up denying Jesus because Jesus knew he was going to stay. But Peter didn't listen to everything that Jesus had to say about this. So here it is. He's there, and this is what's going to happen. So again, Peter had no problem pointing out other people's flaws. He had no problem making sure that people knew who he followed and that all of these things. But Peter was very hard at applying those things to his own life. Okay? He had no problem with making sure others would have that, judge others almost in a way, sometimes with the way he acted. So the disciples, of course, they're all like, hey, we'll be right there too. We're not going to leave. It says so right there. It says, and they all said, verse 31, and they all said the same thing. Okay, they all said the same thing. We're not going to leave you. But again, we see this over and over again. He says, let the disciples go their way. They're supposed to go. They were supposed to, and Zechariah, that's exactly what it says, that the sheep will be scattered. That's exactly what that means. He's talking that they should have gone, but Peter refused to listen to that. Peter refused, and he stayed right there, got himself into trouble, denied Jesus, cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, did all these things. Okay? But again, because and we can call it loyalty, we can call it whatever we want to. It's okay. But the reality is that when we see this, Jesus said, and this is what's going to happen. But he didn't do it. Now, the other disciples left, right? We saw that. But again, they still said what? We'll stay. But they didn't. They didn't stay. Why? Because they got out of there. They're looking out for number one is what they were doing, making sure they weren't going to lose their life. So again, this is what Peter was doing. So we need to remember here, Jesus wasn't, he didn't, it's not because he was scared to have those disciples there, it's because he knew what he was going to face. He knew what they were going to face. And we see this, and he goes through here, and he talks about the Garden of Gethsemane. We see here where he took, if you notice here, he goes to the Gethsemane, and he looks at them in verse 33. He took with him, closer to him, he took Peter, James, and John. Okay, those three individuals he took with him. He wanted this companionship with him. He wanted to, as he faced distress. This is a time when Jesus had great distress in his life. Okay, so these three men that he had gone closer to, they were all there. And so here we see them, here we see this happening to them. And so here we see, by the way, these are the same individuals that he took on the Mountain of Transfiguration, the same individuals that with Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead. It's all these things that happen here. These individuals were very important to him. And Jesus had this struggle, and he wanted them to be to make sure that they could be part of this. That he was going to be be hung on the cross. And that Jesus knew he was going to be hung on the cross, didn't he? He did. He knew he was going to be hung on the cross. He knew what Peter was going to do. He even told him, you're going to deny me. He knew all of these things. And so we need to remember that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, that we're reminded that he became sin for us. That he died on the cross, and to bear, literally, he became a curse. Because in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, it talks about the curse of the cross and of the law. It talked about that he became that. So so he was there. So Jesus had physical sorrow. He was going to have spiritual sorrow. And here he was in the garden. Okay? Here he was in the garden. And the top three guys he brought, what did they do? They fell asleep. Right? These individuals that were with him, they fell asleep. And we know that Jesus was going to be in sorrow. We know that Jesus tells us that the very same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, remember, broke the bread and gave her the cup, of reminding the disciples, reminding us of what he's going to do on the cross. So here we see this. And then we go and we see him and he's reminding them, oh, you're asleep. You're asleep. Why are you asleep? And if you look at verse 36, okay, verse 36, this is interesting here. It says, and he says, Abba, Father. Okay? And literally, that's an Aramaic word, Abba, Father, right there. And what that means is Jesus was literally saying, Papa, Daddy, my Father, all things are possible with you. See, he had a very personal relationship with his Father, did he not? He did. He had a very personal relationship with him. But he said, all things are possible with you. But Jesus knew what? Jesus knew, no matter what his struggles that he had, physical and emotional, he knew that he had to die on the cross. He knew it. And it was gut-wrenching for him. It was difficult for him. He knew that he had to die on that cross for you and for me. He knew he had to fulfill the work. He knew this. And here he was with his disciples. They're asleep. He knew what he was going through. How many times do we think about this that we forget just how real this is, just how human Jesus is. And we see this, and he's reminding, this is my Father, Daddy, why? I don't want to have to do this, but that's what it requires. That's what I'm going to do. And so his disciples, if you notice there, I highlighted this. It says verse 37, he said, found him sleeping. Then it says there in verse 40, found him sleeping. Then it says there again in verse 41, it says this. It says, are you still sleeping? Okay? He simply asked them to do what? Stay awake. Be alert. Pay attention to what it was that was taking place. Remember that. He says, because in verse 37, he says, could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Could you not pay attention just for one simple hour? Could you not do so? And here we see this. And what is he saying, really saying to the disciples? There's two different worlds that we live in. Okay, I'm not talking about dimensions and stuff like that, okay? We have the physical world and the spiritual world. And Jesus here is reminding them of the spiritual battle here. They're physically tired, but they also have this spiritual battle that is taking place. All he simply told them to do is to watch and to pray. To pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on around. Pay attention to these things. And then Jesus was, that's all he was trying to say to them. But yet, they were sleeping. They were sleeping. He rebuked them. He warned them. He says, are you still doing it? He says, my hour, verse 41 says, my hour has come. I'm being betrayed. I'm being betrayed into the hands of sinners. This is one of the most, to me, this is a very interesting interaction here that's taking place. Jesus, in a way, calls the hypocrisy almost of the guards those coming out to have him arrested, because he said, you know what, you could have done this anytime you wanted to in broad daylight. I've never hid myself. But yet here we are at night, and you're coming to get me. That's what he said, didn't it? That's what he said. Okay? He said, here I am. I've preached daily in the synagogues. I've done all these things. In verse 43, he says, you know what, you're coming. They came out with him with swords and with clubs. And he said, and then he says, like, you're coming out to me like I'm a thief. Okay, like I'm some criminal. This is what you're coming out here. And then it's interesting to me, because the same people who were having Jesus arrested, the same people came out with clubs, and they came out with staves and all these things. The same people knew who Jesus looked like. Am I right? I have a hard time believing they did not know what Jesus looked like. All of a sudden, it took Judas to kiss him to point out who he was. Did you ever notice that? It takes Judas to point out who Jesus was. Maybe it was too dark. Maybe their eyes were blinded to who was, what was going on around him. But I always find this exchange quite interesting. He says, because you're coming out here like I am some criminal, coming out here like you. And then when Judas gives him a kiss, it's almost like they had no idea who he was. Okay? And all of a sudden, there he is. This is who he is. And it says there in verse 46, after Judas kissed him and said, this is who it is, then verse 46 says, they took him. They laid hold of him and they took him. This whole group was there. And it's so interesting. Like I said, I just always find this very interesting, because why did they wait till so long? I'll tell you why they did. Okay? You can write this down if you would like. Because Jesus' time had not yet come. Okay? That's why they didn't take him in the daylight. That's why they didn't take him earlier in the day. They had to take him at that very moment in time, because that was the very moment in time that God the Father set aside for Jesus to be arrested at. Okay, that's why it took place when it didn't. Again, we can look at all these things. Oh, man, that's kind of weird. It is, if you think about it, right? But whose timing is it? It's God's. And it wasn't the timing to be in front of all the people. It was to be at night, kind of not really in a secluded place, but in a secluded place at the same time, not too far from the city. And here we see this happening. So this is what they did. So again, Peter does something that only Peter could do. Now remember, when we started out, verse 27, it says, and the sheep shall be scattered. Peter was there. Peter was he's going to deny Jesus here. And now Peter comes out. And Peter does something very, very interesting here. He gets out a knife. He gets out a knife, and he cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Okay, I want you to think about that for a moment. All these people just came out with clubs and all this other stuff, and Peter's like, I'll fight you to the death. He was serious, was he not, when he said that? So here we see Peter's sincerity, but again, he wasn't really quite understanding the whole significance of what was taking place. But yet he was willing to die for that. So that's what we need to remember. Peter, again, you can read about that in John chapter 18, verse 10, where he cuts off the ear of Malchus. But remember, guys, we don't fight against spiritual weapons. We fight with physical weapons. It's spiritual that we fight. Peter used the wrong weapon at the wrong time for the wrong purpose. Okay? That's what he was doing. And Jesus, of course, we know, ended up healing him, healing Malchus. We touched him by the ear. And eventually, Peter himself, we know that Peter would have even been arrested if this would not have taken place. You could not have attacked the priest the way that he did. So now the disciples, they forsook Jesus. They have gone. And we even see here that a young disciple following Jesus in verse 51, we see that this is what's taking place, and they are now scattered, and this poor guy's running around with no clothes on. Okay? All right? And here he is. He's running out there, and we're not quite sure if this was John Mark or not. We just know that this was a young man who witnessed this take place, and they tried to grab him, and he ran off so that this could take place. Again, we're not sure exactly who this person was, because the Gospel of Mark is the only book of the Gospels that records this event. Okay, so we don't really know exactly who this person was, other than the soldiers were very much trying to get him, and he pulled off that honor garment that was there, and they tried to arrest him, so he ran away as quickly as possible. I want to take a moment and let's go to John chapter 16. Let's go to John chapter 16, verse 32, if you will, and I want you to see some of these events that we see taking place here in the garden. So again, it's John chapter 16, verse 32, and it says this to us. It says this: "Behold, an hour is coming, and has already come, for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me." Does not Jesus eventually, when he gets arrested, in less than 24 hours after this event's taking place, or right thereabouts, Jesus loses his life? They didn't waste a lot of time. Okay, they didn't waste a lot of time. If you were found guilty, you were found guilty. You were punished, whatever that punishment might be. So now we know that the disciples have finally got away, are now scattering after the arrest of Jesus Christ. Now we have, picking up the events in verse 53. It says, "They led Jesus away to the high priest." That's the first thing you have to do, is you're going to take him to the high priest, because the high priest is the one who is buddy-buddy usually with the Roman centurions, with the Roman government. This is usually the person who you're going to go to when you want to try to have your enemies destroyed. So here we see this. It says, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders of the scribes gathered together. All these people who don't like each other show up in one room. Okay? They show up in one room, and that is there. So here we have here, and if you notice here, if you go there, we won't do so. But if you go to John chapter 18, you'll find that this first place that he's at, he's with Annas, the former high priest. Okay, he is not the current sitting high priest. He is the former high priest. And then it moved to a full council of witnesses. Because remember, you cannot convict someone without what? Proof. Witnesses. So here come the witnesses. Now, of course, they were all truthful, right? Right? All the witnesses were truthful. So now we have all these truthful witnesses standing there, and they're doing this. They're doing this over and over again. Verse 54. Peter followed him from a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. That's a shocker, wasn't it? Couldn't find anything against Jesus. Couldn't find anything to put him to death. This is what happened to Paul. If Paul never would have appealed to Caesar, Paul never would have went to Rome. Okay? But he appealed to Caesar, because every time he went before Festus and others, it's like, we found nothing worthy of death of this man. But yet here we see the same thing taking place. And here we see this. So now we know from verse all the way, we won't read this, but you're more than welcome to, all the way down to verse 65. Here in Matthew chapter 14, we see this take place. We see the full court. We see the witnesses taking place. We see them asking Jesus questions. And it tells us there in verse 62. And the high priest looks at Jesus and says, "Are you the Christ?" Okay, in verse 61. Then in verse 62 it says, and he said, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Now, I love this whole scene here from the standpoint of the priests. They thought that they were so righteous. They thought they were so right with God. They thought they knew everything about what God's word has to say. Look what it says. And they tore their clothes. They were so mad that he said he was who he said that he was, and they ripped their clothes off out of their anger and their frustration. Did you see that? From these people who have just tried to get liars to try to lie about Jesus, who have concocted all kinds of stories about Jesus throughout his ministry. Now they think they're so self-righteous, they rip their clothes off. Can you believe he said that? That's what just took place. Okay? And so here they are, right there. It says that to them. It says there in verse, tearing their clothes. I mean, they literally did it. They tore the clothes like they'd never done a thing wrong in their life, and they're always Jesus' best buddies. Now that he said he's equal with God, how dare he? Okay? This is what takes place. So then they say this: what further Do we have a witness? We've got to get rid of this guy. We don't need any more liars to come up here and try to prove who he is. Because Jesus was the only one who spoke the truth in the whole conversation. Okay? He's the only one that answered truth to any questions about this whole sham of a trial that's taking place. This whole thing. You know, Peter denies Jesus Christ. Peter's sitting outside around a fire to keep warm. It's cold outside. He's right there. And then we find in chapter 15, verse 1, it says, early in the morning. So it means every other of the events that we just read took place at night. Okay? So then it says, early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council, you know, the ones who ripped their clothes, you know, the ones who thought they were so self-righteous and they were so much better than this guy, Jesus, okay? And the scribes immediately held a consultation. We got to get together and do something about this. Besides, I got to go home and get some new clothes. These are ripped, okay? All right, you got to do something about this Jesus. All right? It says immediately held a consultation. It says, in binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Of course, right before that, in chapter 14, we see a few other things take place prior to this. But we see this happening. We see these individuals, they come together. What are we going to do with Jesus? Listen, they've gone this far. Okay? So they've got to do something now with Jesus. So they've decided they're going to take him to Pilate. Remember, they couldn't do anything. Please remember that. They had zero authority to put him in, to have him killed like they wanted to. They couldn't do it. So they went to the one person who could have Jesus Christ put to death, and that was a Roman who they didn't like. Okay, some of these guys were only in it for political reasons, but yet, boy, it's funny how all these people get together when they want to get rid of Jesus, isn't it? So this is what we see happening here in Mark chapter 14. We see Peter in Mark chapter 14. We see him denying Jesus Christ. We see at the end of chapter 14, we see that Peter weeps because he remembers the words that Jesus Christ spoke to him. Okay, we remember these things. Once Jesus Christ was arrested, Peter should have been gone, but he wasn't. Okay, and here he was right there, and now we see them bringing him him being brought before Pilate. The only one who could do anything, the only one who could have Jesus Christ put to death. So here they were. They have these questions that are taking place. They have all these things. And if you notice here, that there's a whole bunch of different things that happen throughout here. Verse 57 says, so some stood up and began to give false testimony against him. And they began to bring all of these witnesses against Jesus Christ. Isn't it funny that the Pharisees and the high priests and all these people, did they not ever witness Jesus Christ speaking these words? Yes, but they couldn't muster up enough lie for themselves, I guess. Okay, because they would have heard him say all these things too. Why is that? Because they couldn't stand him. They knew some of the things he said. He called them some pretty interesting names. Okay? Whitewashed tombs and all these things. You look good on the outside, but on the inside you're rotten. Remember, he called them these things. So here they are, but yet they had to get other people to come do that. They had to get other people because they could not do so. So they're together. They had to have at least two witnesses. Remember, you can't convict someone based upon one witness. So you have to have multiple witnesses or multiple liars that you're going to come up there to try to get these people with. And so this is what's happening here. And again, it says here, then we kind of, the picture shifts a little bit. And they begin to get a little upset with Jesus. Okay? If you notice here, Jesus, it says in verse 36 that they tore their clothes. These self-righteous guys, they tore their clothes. And we don't need any more death. He's deserving of death because of what he said. Then it says in verse 65, they're so mad at Jesus. It says, and some began to spit on him. I mean, they're so mad at him, they spit on him right there in verse 65. And then it says, and to blindfold him. Okay, and to blindfold him. And listen to the reason that they blindfolded him. Okay, it says this, and again to blindfold and to beat him with their fists, and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers received with him slaps in the face. They beat him and they punched him and they hit him. They're like, who did that to you? So they're continuing to mock him over and over again. Oh, who did that to you, Jesus? And then they mocked him and they mocked him and they mocked him. So now, then Peter denies ever knowing Jesus. Now, I'm not saying I would have been any different, but we need to remember here that truthfully, once Jesus was arrested, Peter should have skedaddled. Okay, that's what Jesus told him to do. We read that to you. He said then he was going to take the shepherd and the sheep were going to scatter. Was Peter a shepherd? Or was he a sheep? He was a sheep. Okay? So he didn't do so, but here he was getting himself. Now remember, he said he wasn't going to do it. He said, I'll never deny you. All of that stuff. Well, he's right there where he shouldn't be, but he's there. And he is going to, and everything he says is going to come back. And for lack of better terminology, it's going to bite him. Okay? It's going to bite him. He said, I will never do this. I will never, ever forsake you. So again, the leaders would do their best not to lie here in court, but they would have no problem with others doing so. So we need to remember this. Jesus Christ said nothing. He didn't get up there and say, these guys are false witnesses. They can't speak. They don't even know who they are. He didn't say anything. It tells us in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, and 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, those very things. And the high priest said to him, you know what? Who are you? Who are you? Who was he, everybody? Son of God. That's who I am. He's not going to deny that. He's not going to deny who he is. He said, this is who I am. I am Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is who I am. And again, they mock him. They mock Peter. They try to get Peter. To deny Jesus Christ, and he does. He gives in to those things based upon the circumstances. The Roman soldiers, they were coming in and they were doing all kinds of things. They were rude. They were pretty crude people, the Roman soldiers. And so here we see all this event, guys. Over one person who said nothing more than to turn to God, who said nothing more that he is the Son of God. That's all he said. He never led a rebellion. He never told the Jewish people not to pay taxes. He never did any of those things. But yet the Jewish people were going to get rid of this guy because he was nothing more than a thorn in their flesh and their side, literally. So that is exactly what is taking place. So let's see some things here about Peter. Let's look a little bit closer here at him. Remember, Jesus has been carried off from the garden. Jesus has been carried off into the high priest's area. There's a fire. Peter has been sitting out there. And the first thing we find is that he's sitting around the fire and he's like, I don't know the guy. I don't know the guy. And that's exactly what we see here right there in verse 67. He's warming himself and she, a young lady, she looked at him and said, you were with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you're talking about. No idea what you're talking about. And he went out onto the porch, and a rooster crowed. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, there's no way. I don't know this. Guys, he was out watching for Peter is what he was doing there. And I'm not sure that we would have not necessarily been the same way at that case. We don't know what we would have been, but we know Peter was. Yeah, that we do know for certain. That we can see. And here we see this. And then it goes on. And then another servant girl saw them. In verse 69 it says, and then this is one of them. Okay? So 2 times. This is one of them. This is who it is. It's interesting. The servant girls paid attention. The people paid attention who was with Jesus. You see, guys, we must understand that. People pay attention to Christians. People pay attention to you and to me. People pay attention, especially if we say we go to church. Especially if we say we're followers of Jesus Christ. They pay attention even if we don't think they're paying attention. But here's two people. 2 people saying, you were with him. I saw you with him. I know that you were right there. I know this man he was right there. And again, in verse 70, but again, so 2 times, he denied it. I was never with him. And then it says, and then after a little while, the bystanders were again saying, remember, bystanders. They were there. They saw who followed Jesus, said this, surely you're one of them, for you're a Galilean too. They paid attention. And then it says in verse 71 what? He began to cuss and swear. He began to let it fly, guys. I mean, he began to just, you know what? I don't know what you're all talking about. You guys are crazy. I'm the crazy one. You guys are crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. And then it tells us this. It tells us in verse 72 that immediately, the rooster crowed. Immediately. As soon as that third denial came out, the rooster crowed. Because it says there immediately. I don't know this guy. I don't know who what you're even talking about. Man, and Peter's words just flying out of his mouth. But what happened? All of a sudden, Peter remembered what Jesus said. Remember, not only does he remember what Jesus said, he had to remember what he said. And what did he say? I'll never forsake you. I'll never leave you. I'll never deny you. And then he remembered what Jesus said. Yes, you will. In fact, you're going to do it, and this is what's going to happen. And what happened? Exactly what Jesus said was going to happen. That's something that we need to remember. Peter, he went out, and as soon as it says there, it says, and immediately the rooster crowed. And it says there, and he began to weep. Why did he begin to weep? Because he realized the seriousness of the situation. He realized what he said versus what he did. He realized what Jesus Christ was doing, and there he was. And Peter, again, with all great intentions, but yet there he was. And we need to understand that Peter was right there, and he knew this. We can't judge Peter. We must remember we're not really much different than he is. That we are people, that we have our mistakes, and we do those things that we shouldn't do. But you know what? Let's see what God can do for us. I want us to just take a moment, if you would, and turn to John chapter 21. Okay. And I want you to see something here. And as you remember, Peter, he preached a pretty good sermon in the book of Acts. Anybody remember that? Thousands of people came to know Jesus, and the gospel spread, right? How is he able to do that when he denied Jesus? Because he got right with Jesus. Okay? But I want you to see some things here. Here's some things of what happened with Jesus. Now on the first day of the week, verse 1, Mary Magdalene came early into the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, so John, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. So Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. It's interesting. He said that's where they're going. It says they were going to the tomb, and it says in verse 4 that the two were running together, and the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first. And stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. And so Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb, and he saw the linen cloth wrappings lying there. And in the face cloth which had been on the head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up on the place by itself. So the other disciple who had come first to the tomb then also entered and saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So it says, so the disciples went away to their own homes. And Mary was outside of the tomb in verse 11, and she was weeping. And the angels came. It's like, where's the body of Jesus? Where's the body of Jesus? And it says, woman, why are you weeping? Verse 13, because they've taken away my Lord. Verse 14, when she said this, she turned around, saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener. And said to him, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. And then we go on further here in John chapter 20, and what you will find is you will see that Jesus appears, and Jesus appears to his disciples. And if you go down just a little bit further to verse 19, And it says, so when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut, when the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, peace be with you. And when he had said this, he showed them both his hands and his side. The disciples then rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you. When he had said this, he breathed on them, and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. And then it goes on in verse 24. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, we have seen the Lord. But he said, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. Isn't it interesting that here was Thomas, had seen him, had heard all these things, said, unless I see it the way I think I should see it, I won't believe. It's exactly what he did. And then it goes on just a little bit further. And Jesus, and here we see this happening. He goes down a little bit further. It says, after 8 days, verse 26, the disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut. Again, they were still scared, and stood in the midst and said, peace be with you. And Thomas, and then he said to Thomas, reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here your hand and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing. Thomas answered and said, my Lord and my God. You see, and then we read in the book of Acts where Peter came to that full understanding, completely begin to grasp who Jesus Christ is. He said it in many of his words. And here we saw in Mark chapter 14, we see him speaking those words, and yet, and we need to remember that he figured it out. It took him a little while, but he figured it out. And I just want to encourage all of us tonight. You know what? That public, if we live our life for Christ, people will see it. You don't have to go stand on the street corner on the pillar and up there preaching with the Bible in your hand. If you feel led by God to do so, absolutely. But the reality is that if you and I simply live our life for Christ, people will see it. And I want to encourage all of us, let us not deny Jesus Christ as Peter did. But let us begin to embrace who he is. Because he is the Son of God who is alive. And I want us to encourage you tonight. Just trust him. Trust him and let him lead your life. I'm just going to close this in a word of prayer, and I want you to think about that confession that you have. Do other people see Jesus in you when they see you? Father God, I thank you for your word. Lord God, I pray that you'll help us to take it and apply it to our lives. Lord, I pray that we won't be like Peter. We won't be like the other disciples. But Lord God, I pray that, Lord, we'll trust you. But Lord, when we fall, and we will, the Lord will come back to you as quickly as possible. Teach us that every day. Show us your word every day. And Lord God, I pray that we can make a difference in someone's life this week and use your church. And I ask these things in your name. Amen. Please remember Bible study Tuesday and Wednesday. We also have food pantry on Friday. So again, thank you guys for coming tonight, and I will look forward to seeing you then.